So a number of BBC staff have reportedly expressed disgust and called for presenter Gary Lineker to be sacked after accusations of anti-Semitism. The Match of the Day presenter last week criticised the Israeli government's actions in Gaza as completely out of proportion to the October 7th attacks, whilst also suggesting that staying silent on this issue means that people are almost complicit. Several days later, he shared a pro-Palestinian message featuring a rat emoji on social media, a symbol historically used as an anti-Semitic slur. He later deleted the post and apologised unreservedly. Gary Lineker, who is paid £1.4 million by the BBC last year, said that he was unfazed by the prospect of his comments provoking a negative reaction. He has previously been accused of breaking BBC's impartiality rules in 2023 for comparing the then government's rhetoric over its immigration policy to that of Nazi Germany. So, should Gary Lineker still be working for the BBC? Joining me now is journalist Nicole Lampert and former head of religion and ethics at the BBC and Channel 4, Aaqil Ahmed. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining both of us. I don't believe that there's any kind of debate here over whether the image that Gary Lineker shared was anti-Semitic and inappropriate, right? Mm-hmm. Rats, of course, have been associated with Jews really for hundreds of years. I guess the big debate comes down to what the BBC should do about it. I mean, what do you think about this?
Well, I think they're in a difficult position, actually. You could argue they've already made a decision, and that is his main contract, the contract which he has to present Match of the Day, finishes at the end of this season. And I think that's the thing that we need to look at here, because basically he doesn't present current affairs programmes, so therefore he's also not a full-time member of the BBC. He's a person that is employed a day or 2 days a week to do Match of the Day. That contract, they have decided, they may argue that it's not connected to this, but they have decided that it's not going to be renewed. So therefore he's not going to be presenting Match of the Day going forward. He will be on a freelance basis presenting, whether it be, FA Cup or the World Cup or even golf or whatever it is that they may come and ask him to do as a freelance presenter. Had he been still contracted or 2-3 years into a contract to do Match of the Day, I think they may be in a much more difficult position, and I think there would have had to have been a much more thorough investigation that may have led to something of that nature. Because obviously you don't just sack somebody for the first thing that they do, depending on what it is. It depends on what it is. Now, on this one, I think it's a very big one. It's a very big mistake. It's not the same as having an opinion that says, I believe there's a genocide or I believe this. The rat emoji or the whole rat thing that he forwarded on, yes, you can apologise, but I think some of these things have to be looked at beyond the apology.
That's fair enough. I mean, but I think some people would argue, Nicole, I know I read an article with you this week from you, that this isn't a one-off. That's part of the problem, isn't it?
This is a story of seeing someone becoming more and more radicalised. So in February last year, I tackled Lineker over his social media use, partly because he'd posted a tweet at that time that was a petition calling that Israel should be banned from the UEFA Cup. So, of course, while he might argue that he doesn't have to be neutral on current affairs, this was about football, which is very much his world.
And he was very much in contract at the time.
He was very much in contract at the time, and he's still very much in contract. That's the thing. So he might be coming to the end of that contract, but he's also contracted to still do the FA Cup and the World Cup. Now, if you're a football journalist, presenting at the World Cup is the kind of the highlight of a career, really. It's the top football games, isn't it? And it's the ones that everyone watch. So why should he be rewarded and continue to be rewarded for racism?
Yeah, well, this is, of course, British taxpayers, licence fee payers' money. We're forced to pay for it, and I think a lot of people feel, including myself, to be frank, feel resentful, money going towards him. But the point is that with this contract that he signed, he made an agreement that he should be impartial. Now, there's a separate debate, which I wouldn't mind us getting into, actually, whether this impartiality of journalists and commentators is necessary. But the point is that when he took those millions from the British people, he made an agreement, he signed it, that his opinions were off the table.
I think it's easy to try and lump all of this together, but you're talking about things that have gone over a long period of time. Now, in terms of the impartiality thing, I completely agree. Having had to manage those kind of situations, I get it. I actually think the conversation he had about the UEFA, that thing, I think that's when he actually did go over the line. in my opinion, because it's linked to his job. As you said, quite rightly saying, I think that's a mistake. I think as somebody who's not a current affairs presenter, that's when you have a conversation about what his opinions on social media, depending on what they are and how far you go. This is why the current thing is a problem for me, the rat thing. Depending on what you say, you should be allowed to have an opinion, whether you or I agree with that opinion. And he's not a current affairs presenter. Now, I think with Gary, and actually I think we talk about him a lot, but there are other people who are presenters on the BBC, Channel 4, ITV and Sky and GB News or whatever it may be, who have opinions which are very strong in on various different subjects, but we seem to focus on Gary Lineker a lot.
Well, because he's arguably he's first of all how much he's paid, but also not being a first-time offence. But I think also that some people, I'll ask Nicole if that's all right, just there seems to be a whiff of hypocrisy. There's Danny Baker, he's not a commentator and such, but he told a joke that then he hadn't realised was offensive, and he was fired accordingly.
Straight away.
So there seems to be this hypocrisy from the BBC that one person the rules apply to and the other person it doesn't.
And he's been what we've seen is Gary Lineker becoming radicalised. This is far from a one-off. He's been indulging in his Instagram stories, so they stories that pop up for 24 hours, but in Holocaust inversion, which is basically means that he's calling Israelis akin to Nazis, which, according to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, is anti-Semitism. He's also been using anti-Zionist Jews to call Zionist Jews the biggest anti-Semites.
And now 94%, is it? 96% of Jews are Zionists.
And also, and this is something that I tackled him with nearly 2 years ago, or a year ago.
Well, you interviewed him?
When I was...
It wasn't like me just abusing him on social media.
No, I was at an event and he didn't like the questions I asked about the UEFA thing. So actually afterwards, other people had stood up and applauded him and I sat down. So he did come and talk to me and we had a row for about 20 minutes. And one of the things I talked to him about was the fact that he was retweeting people that had the inverted red triangle, which symbolises support for Hamas. What the inverted red triangle supports is, I am coming after you. And after that conversation with him, he did stop retweeting people with that for quite a long time, but in the last month or so, he's done it twice. So he knows what he's doing. And because he, as you say, he's the highest paid TV presenter, so he has become symbolic of where we are in terms of neutrality or not neutrality, and he's very much not neutral. But you could also say that perhaps the BBC isn't neutral on this anymore. But I guess there are two things. There's neutrality and then there's racism. And he's gone into racism. And as you say, with Danny Baker, when there was racism, straight away being fired. And we haven't seen that with Gary Lineker, and in fact, quite the opposite. And so, yes, he may not be doing Match of the Day anymore, but the FA Cup and the World Cup, and also the BBC is paying to host his podcasts.
Well, they're not paying to host his podcast.
Okay.
They're commissioning. Commissioned the podcast. There's a big difference in terms of...
He's getting some dosh, though.
He's getting some dosh because they want to be linked to that, because obviously this is a very successful podcast. And we've got to be honest as well. It's not just, we could pluck out Danny Baker, we could pluck out anybody. The fact of the matter is there are always anomalies. There's the whole issue around people who have been allowed to continue when they have done things and said things which are really inappropriate on all broadcasters, but particularly on the BBC as well. That's not just about these two individuals. You've got Anton de Berck, who made racist comments, and actually slight apology, and everyone's supposed to forget that it ever happened, that he was very, very racist.
Have those accusations come up again?
No, all I'm saying to you is, you could pluck individual cases out and have a conversation about this. The big question is, I think, what the Gary Lineker thing has done is actually bring into focus that we have an interpretation of what people's roles are, their contracts, and what the relationship is with the audience and the broadcaster, for that matter. And actually, it's out of date. And what's happened, we're talking, these things are really new, last 2-3 years, and people are catching up and trying to figure out, how do we work with this? We could have a conversation about, even with GB News, and what it means with regards to, the regulation of GB News, for instance. There's a lot of catching up that has to be done because it's really new. Now, Gary is a a portfolio career kind of presenter. He's not staff. He works in a certain kind of way. One day here, he worked for TNT or BT Sport or whatever. He'll work for lots of other different people, has his own company. How do you police that with the way that we used to police how somebody should operate when they work for an organisation? Now, on the day that he's working on Match of the Day, you can police it because you can quite rightly say, you are working for the BBC on this day. But what he does away from that, how do you police it? Because he's not working for you
Well,
anymore.
I guess the point is, if it says quite clearly in the contract, though, that his social media
but I imagine that that's where the grey line is coming in, because actually there's lots of arguments around what are you policing and when can you police it, which is why I believe ultimately they have made the big decision, which is to say, let's look at a world for Match of the Day without Gary, and then he does the odd thing, which will then eventually dwindle down and he won't be working for the BBC. That's probably what's going to happen. So a decision has been made. It's just maybe not been announced in the way that you might want it to be.
Well, but it might also be that the BBC, Nicole, is showing hypocrisy on this, not just in terms of like one-off issues, but in just terms of the total subject of course, Israel. Now, it's of course, people who are very pro-Israel think that the BBC have been anti-Semitic or accused of anti-Semitism. Of course, the other side would make the opposite, that they're anti-pro-Palestinian, but that isn't necessarily the case. Just because one thinks that, it doesn't mean that they're actually balanced just because both people are unhappy.
Yeah. I mean...
What I'm trying to say is that the Israel side is right.
I mean, I would say that Gary's... One thing that would be in his contract, because it's in everyone's contract, everybody that signs a contract who works for any company is about bringing the company into disrepute. And that is something that Gary has done. He's brought it into disrepute with his racist tweets. Now, in terms of the BBC in general... already it was in trouble, and it was in trouble in two ways. One, there was a cultural review after the Hugh Edwards and all of that, which showed that they should never have one person having all the power, and that people who complain about things should be listened to. And that's not what happened with Hugh Edwards and various others. And this obviously goes back to Jimmy Savile, all these stories that people knew about, but because they were talent, they were allowed to get away with it. And Gary Lineker is very much part of that. And then we already have the BBC in disrepute because of the documentary that it did a few weeks ago, where somebody that was in it is the son of a Hamas commander, a Hamas politician, and it wasn't said in the documentary. So the BBC has been reviewing that for a good 6-7 weeks now.
Should we point out that Gary Lineker has been very pro this documentary and saying it's censorship by withdrawing it?
Yeah, and along with other BBC names, he has demanded that it comes back on, even though Samir Shah, the chairman of the BBC, called it a dagger to the heart of BBC neutrality. So these are all things that are affecting the BBC's reputation. And the BBC is more important to all of us, while GB News is very important and Sky and all of that. BBC is the only one that we have to pay for.
Yeah. Well, can I just read you out a quote?
Well, that reputation, by the way, on that particular story, also, we're not bringing in Channel 4. So Channel 4 News also had that young boy in as well, because the fact of the matter is, if you're not allowed in, nobody is allowed in. Journalists are not allowed into Gaza. They haven't been from day one. No, I've been to war zones all my life. The Israeli authorities don't let you in. Journalists want to go in. They've not been allowed in. Now, if you're not allowed in, you are relying on people inside there now. And the fact of the matter is, not everybody is going to be honest with you. And it's difficult to do your usual job.
But any journalist would know in that situation that any information is going to come from Hamas.
It's going to be coming from lots of people, but it's going to be controlled by Hamas, just as it's controlled by the other side as well. But the fact of the matter is, if you are a journalist, I used to work in war zones. It's not easy, it's really difficult, and it's not much fun. But on this one, you're not even allowed in, full stop. So you actually are relying on people inside Gaza, and with that comes all the things you've said.
Due diligence.
Well, but it's virtually impossible to do a lot of due diligence. That's the problem.
Well, I think
that's what we need to review.
But when you have a guy called David Collier, who's just some Jewish guy living in North London who can do the work, look on people's Facebook and find out all this stuff.
No, my point is that what we have to do going forward with all of this, all broadcasters, is actually look at how we can operate in a social media world where you're not allowed to do the things that you thought you could.
Well, this ties into what I want to say, because I want to read this. This is from Tim Davie, Director General in 2020, he said, if you want to be an opinionated columnist or a partisan campaigner on social media, then that is a valid choice, but you should not be working at the BBC. So that's very clear there. It's not about contracts and being one off. Do you think that advice should change now, that actually we live in a world where we do have opinions and that should be acknowledged? Should the BBC drop its pretense of impartiality?
See, I think that's too simple. I can understand why Tim would say that, because that's the world you'd want to be in. But I think it's very difficult to do that if someone's not working for you full-time. And that's where you need that nuance.
But that sounds like a technicality to me.
No, it's not a technical... Well, it's not, though, is it? It's a legality. It's a legal thing about your contractual status. If I'm not working for you more than 3 or 4 days a week, and if I say this is a... As it is today, I'm speaking now on a purely personal basis, not for any of the organisations that I work with, right? So if I make that clear that what I'm saying here is on a purely personal basis, then you have to argue and you have to get into a provable case that actually that's not the case. And I think it would be easier if you could say, right, no social media for anybody. But the thing is, if you've got somebody just working 1 day a week, how do you police that in the real world?
But that statement is pretty clear-cut.
But it...
Work for the BBC, not work for the BBC 24/7.
Yes, but he might think that, but then when you try and enforce that, it then becomes saying something and enforcing something are very different.
Well, it's what do you think, Nicole? Do you think the BBC should just drop all pretense of impartiality?
No, because we pay for them for this reason. But, I also kind of think it's not that hard to not be on social media. And it's certainly not that hard not to be racist on social media. So it should be easily avoided. You can be on social media as a journalist and you can be reporting things without offending people or being biased. So I think we have to push the BBC to be more neutral, and I think this is on many things. For example, Brexit. That was a really big deal, and the BBC didn't feel it was impartial at all, and it was clear that they had no idea it was coming.
There was also a silencing of the gender-critical debate.
Exactly.
They came to that very late now.
If they're there at all, really. I think Helen Joyce might have been on for the first time.
And her book Trans came out 4 years ago.
Exactly. So there are lots of different issues that people have with the BBC, and they need to make more effort to listen to the country. And I think that's probably something that the entire establishment, if I can use that phrase, but is beginning to realise when you look at the success of reform, that people are unhappy with what they see are the norms being pushed on them by the establishment.
Yeah, it's not necessarily diversity of opinion, which I guess is a good thing because that's why this channel exists. But finally, there was an interesting article in the Times, I think Matthew Said, he wrote that what Gary Lineker's doing is actually, regardless of issues of free speech, this is threatening the BBC. His actions are making people less trustful of the BBC, and actually at a very sensitive time for the BBC, this is damaging them, right?
I think it's a fair point. I also think at the same point he has to... It's not black and white, it's not simple, and that's the problem. And I think actually for the management, the simple thing will be the easing out of Gary Lineker for them, because I don't think there's behind him there's a whole load of people coming in with similar kind of views and the reach that he has. So I think you're right, they see it as that, but ultimately they also know it's very difficult to enforce what they want to enforce because of his unique status and of the fact of the matter is that he's very popular as well. He might not be with you, but with a lot of people, he's very popular.
Yeah, no, I mean, but this is the problem, is that we've seen a sort of moral cowardice from our institutions, and that's kind of got us into this situation.
Yeah, but I think if he is punished for what he does, then people will learn that lesson. But ironically, there are journalists that have been punished for criticising Gary Lineker on social media. So he's just been allowed to get away with much more. So it's not just Jewish staff that are unhappy at the BBC, it's all staff, because they follow the rules that he doesn't. And he's paid probably 6 times as much as most of them.
Yeah, well, you know what? I would really love to just never, ever talk again about Gary Lineker. Yeah. That would be my dream.
What would you do for the rest of the 23 hours?
I know, it'd be a nightmare. So thank you very much for joining me. We have journalist Nicole Lampert and former head of religion and ethics at the BBC and Channel 4, Aaqil Ahmed. Thank you so much for joining us. What a great debate. Gary Lineker, he has said in a statement on Instagram, I reposted material which I've since learned contained offensive references. I very much regret those references. I would never knowingly share anything anti-Semitic. It goes against everything I believe in. The post was removed as soon as I became aware of the issue. I take full responsibility for this mistake. The image does not reflect my reviews. It was an error on my part, for which I apologise unreservedly. The BBC says it does not comment on individuals, but has previously defended its handling of anti-Semitism accusations. The BBC spokesperson said, editorially, we are committed to the highest standards of impartiality in our journalism, and in a small number of cases there have been mistakes made. We acknowledge this. Where staff conduct has fallen below expectations, we have taken action. Woo!